Joined now by the Advocate's own Wilson Alexander. Good evening, good sir. Good to have you in here again. It's been a fun little off season that we've had here so far.
The off season doesn't exist anymore, Blake. Come on, you know that.
It does not. You know, it's interesting, Wilson, that people ask me, like, my brother or mom, dad, whatever, like, hey, what are you doing this off season? I'm like, what off season? Like, this isn't. We don't have one of those because, look, we got spring camp that starts next week, which you were able to sit down with Brian Kelly and get an exclusive interview with him. Let me ask a very open-ended question. In your interview with Brian Kelly, what was the number one thing that you walked away with in talking with him?
Two things. I'll say two things. The first one is the Harold Perkins going back to inside linebacker. The second one, which I haven't written about yet, but we'll have a story on sometime in the next week, is just how much the run game schematically is going to change. I don't know if people fully grasp just how different it's apparently going to look, according to Brian Kelly anyway. With Jaden Daniels gone, they're going to be going under center at times. Never saw that over the last 2 years. There'll be tosses, power, counter, a lot more variety in the run game. And I think that's something that it's kind of interesting and I know somewhat inside football, but something that's really going to matter for this team next year. But I guess, that's probably 1B. 1A is Harold Perkins moving back to inside linebacker.
All right. So that's actually the two things I wanted to talk to you about most. So let's go with Harold Perkins, number one. Wilson, last night I got in a lot of trouble with LSU fans because we talked about your story. And I think in my evaluation of the film breakdown, I think Harold Perkins is one of the most dynamic players in the SEC. The problem is everything that he's been in the run game, not just in the inside, Wilson, but on the outside too. I guess what is the plan here with him? I read your article and I understand what Brian Kelly's trying to say, but it seems like they're going to still try to do multiple things maybe to see if he picks it up. Like what am I misreading what he's saying?
No, I don't think so. And there's still some, unclarity in terms of some unanswered questions in terms of what exactly they're going to have Harold be doing at inside linebacker. I mean, that didn't necessarily come through all the way, more so just the fact that he's going to be back at that will linebacker spot specifically. And, so we're going to have to kind of see, because we also don't know exactly what Blake Baker is going to be drawing up for this defense. What does he want Harold to do? I think a lot of people saw he's going back to inside linebacker and immediately thought about him playing inside linebacker in Matt House's defense, where they were dropping into soft coverages and had him away from the ball so much. Blake Baker's got a little bit more of an aggressive style. Brian Kelly said that last year LSU's defense was kind of ended up being bend but don't break. He does not expect that to be what Blake is doing this year and what he constructs. And so, that leads me to think that maybe Harold will be, actually attacking the ball a little bit more, coming downhill, and, maybe we'll actually see a little bit more blitzing than we did last year. That could be a way to, I think, maybe really make it work with him at inside linebacker. But there are also going to be things that they just got to work with him on technically. Like you said, defending the run is not necessarily his strong suit. He's got to be able to get a little bit better about getting his face, there in the middle of the action. And so this is going to be contingent, Brian Kelly said, on a couple of things, them coaching, but also Harold being able to do that.
And what you just said, in watching a lot of stuff that Missouri did, obviously LSU, and we broke all of it down during the season. Blake Baker is not going to sit on his hands. A lot like, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to Matt House, Matt did not send the heat. Now, he did against A&M later in the season, Wisconsin, whatever, but they had to. And I just think, Wilson, for me, with Harold Perkins, I agree with you. I don't think that because I saw the not really backlash, but when your article went out, quote tweets galore. Okay, everybody's like, oh my God, this isn't going to work. Brian Kelly, what is he doing? And I'm like, it's a completely different system and scheme that's coming here with Blake Baker that I think is being overlooked here. In reference to him in the running game, Wilson, I just don't, he's so good at see ball, get ball, probably the best in the SEC. The problem that I think that we've had here that what we talked about that he's got to work on is, Wilson, just how bad he's been in the running game at times that people just, we don't really talk about ever. Did Brian Kelly allude to that in the running game about him getting better there and what they want to do with him and specifically maybe early downs or anything?
No, we didn't get into that, and that's kind of what I mean about like some unanswered questions still in terms of what is this going to like what's going to be required of Harold in that regard, and what is LSU going to have him doing? And look, some of that we're probably not going to know until they play USC because they're not going to want to give away the secrets of the defense. But
Right.
maybe we can kind of get some more answers on that in spring practice because that part is still kind of unanswered and unclear at this point in terms of how is he going to improve in the run game? How is LSU going to use him? The other unanswered question, and this is just partially on me for thinking about it after I left Brian Kelly's office, is what this means for Whit Weeks. If LSU, because he said that Harold Perkins is going to be playing will linebacker. Well, that was kind of the spot that Whit Weeks would be maybe stepping into. Now, again, we don't know really what Blake Baker's defensive scheme is going to look like. He wants to be 3 down and 4 down fronts, that very modern kind of multiplicity going on. And so there'll probably be packages where LSU has all 3 of them on the field at times. That's be kind of guessing. But if the base defense would be 2 linebackers, what does that mean for Whit Weeks? And, how is LSU going to kind of handle his role is also something unanswered with Harold being back inside.
Okay. I'm going to skip your 1B for just a second because you bring up an interesting point. Wilson, I'm not 1,000% sure that we don't get out to spring practice next week and they're not running a 3-3-5. Like I am not right. Like I'm not sold that that's not what's about to happen here because you got the exclusive and dude, like your Twitter, I'm sure your phone broke yesterday, but then you also had reported about Kimo Macanole moving from offensive line to defensive line. Wilson, they have a massive problem in the interior of that D line. That point alone makes me think, okay, so you're moving Harold back inside. Well, you still have said in interviews that Whit Weeks is going to be a big part of this defense. I mean, every hint that he has given seems like, and Brian Kelly at Notre Dame, running a lot of odd man fronts. That's what he said he wanted to do when he first came here. I don't know if we don't go out there next week, and the number one thing that we talk about is their base defense being a 3-3-5 and hiring Marcus Freeman, who, by the way, at Notre Dame, who runs a 3-3-5. So, Wilson, do you get that sense because of the issues at the interior that they, by necessity, might have to go to that defense?
Maybe. And looking at Missouri last year, Blake ran a lot of different fronts. I mean, they mixed things up from game to game at times. I think going back over the film, we saw 3-3-5. Like that's something that's in his arsenal. And the other thing that's interesting about it, when you mention, we're talking about 3-3-5 for a reason of, the deficiencies of defensive tackle, the issues that could be there. The other thing is, when you're talking about 3-3-5, that's 5 defensive backs. Well, LSU is going to be using a star position now. And that's part of the reason that Harold's going inside is that what Harold was doing last year is essentially the star position. And people don't know a star. Alabama uses it. Georgia uses it. The LA Rams use it. It's prevalent in modern football, but it's not a term that we've really heard around here for the last few years. And
right.
It's kind of like a cross between a nickel and a Sam linebacker. And it basically takes what Harold was doing kind of off the field because you would rather that be a defensive back. So it makes sense if you're running a 3-3-5 to have that star position there as maybe that 5th DB on the field.
Tylen Singleton sounds really interesting in that. So we'll see. Let's move to the offensive side of the ball. I agree with you said 1A, 1B. Wilson, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about on this show in reference to the life beyond Jayden Daniels in the running game. Interested to hear that that they're going to go under center, run some power. Were you kind of getting back to the Notre Dame, like, let's tough this out? It makes me think that Brian Kelly's like, hey, man, we're going to punish some people up front with this offensive line. We're going to get smash mouth. But I got to ask you a different or an add-on to that, too. Not only in the running game, what do you see in there outside of Jayden Daniels? But it feels like they're going to try to slow the tempo down a little bit, too, going into this year. That'd
be interesting. That's not something that I got into with Brian yesterday. And now I'm trying to think back to the bowl game because that was kind of our first view of, Joe Sloan as a play caller, what their tempo was like. And I don't remember seeing any really noticeable differences with that. But I don't know. In terms of tempo, I really don't know. I'm going to have to kind of just see how it plays out. In terms of the, kind of just schematic differences in the run game, I think we all saw this coming because when you don't have Jayden Daniels at quarterback, you're not going to be a zone read team anymore. But they really are going to be going away from that from the sound of it. Like we said, more under center at times, not exclusive. It's not like don't freak out, people. We're not going back to power eye. You're not going to be seeing a toss dive. Don't don't get ahead of ourselves. There's still no fullback here involved, really. But they're going to be going under center at times, I think, especially maybe down at the goal line, which is, I think, a lot of people wanted them to see. More power, tosses, counter stuff that just requires more of your offensive line in general in the run game. And like you said, that looks like a real strength for LSU this year. When you bring back 4 of your 5 offensive linemen, that should be a group that you can really lean on. Now, the only concern here in the run game is there's some, personnel at the backfield. Josh Williams is going to be a little bit limited during spring practice, mostly just because of wear and tear and tendonitis on his knee. Brian Kelly said they just want to be careful with how much he gets used. Caden Durham doesn't get in here to the summer. Trey Holly is indefinitely suspended. And Caleb, so there's a lot on Caleb Jackson going into this spring in particular. He's going to be getting quite a few touches. They're going to have to manage it well in terms of his health as well. Brian Kelly said they brought in some walk-ons to kind of alleviate just how much that he'll be touching the football, and same with Josh Williams. But, Brian Kelly, we all suspected this, but Brian Kelly said this yesterday, like, Caleb Jackson is really stepping in now to the forefront of this offense and expected to be a really big piece of what they do next season.
They got to go get it back from the port. Like, Wilson, look, regardless if Trey Holly is innocent or not and how that all plays out, that's not for me to determine. I'm not a judge. I'm not, not an attorney, that maybe in a past life, whatever. But the bottom line for me is that could take a year, that could take 18 months. We don't know. I don't think you can go into the season with 3 scholarship backs. If what Brian Kelly said in your article in reference to the running game, hey man, I'm not even just thinking 1, maybe even possibly 2. Am I crazy in thinking that they need a back?
No, absolutely not. I thought that they could probably get by with 4, but now that there's so much uncertainty in terms of what Trey Holly's availability is going to be, you probably need to go get one. The legal process is going to take however long it takes. LSU has no control over that. And so if you are trying to kind of account for every possibility, then you probably need to go and get someone. And again, it doesn't need to go and be a feature back, but if you were able to go find somebody kind of like Noah Cain again, who can give you a year or 2 and just kind of give you some touches, that could be really helpful. Brian Kelly said, I haven't checked these numbers exactly. I haven't fact checked it yet, but he said that the running backs last year had about 257 touches. He's expecting them to have 375 this year. So you're talking about 125 touches or so out of the running backs, more than you had last year. There's going to be carries to go around, and you're not going to put that all entirely on 1, 2, or even 3 people. So if you can have a 4th available, then that would probably be helpful just to get in here and there, maybe touch the ball 3-4 times a game or something like that.
They're slowing it down then, right? Like if you're gonna do 100 more carries, I mean, Wilson, they ran the ball. I mean, it's not like they weren't ineffective running the football. I mean, with Jaden, but I mean, maybe it's different because maybe the total number of rushes, Jaden having over 100, it probably doesn't seem like. Who knows? Maybe I'm overthinking that a little bit, but it does seem like you slow that down a little bit. Looking forward to spring next week, Wilson. I ask you this every time. Gate opens on Monday, Tuesday, whatever day that we go out there. What's the first position group you go and look at?
Well, the way we usually go down the field is going to kind of dictate this in some ways because we usually see
right.
the defense first. And so the first thing I'll be looking at is, like you said, one, do we get any hint of what schematically their base is going to look like? Who's out there with the ones, especially at cornerback? Who is kind of getting the first, crack at that competition is probably one of the first things I'll look for. And then as we go further down the field, what's that shakeup looking like the rotation looking like at receiver? Is probably the second thing I'll look at right out of the gate.
So Kimo Macanole, and I always say the young man's name wrong. I hope I'm getting it as right as I can. Is moving over to defense. Wilson, I think we're going to come out of spring and look at this O-line and be like, man, they're dominating everybody. But, yeah, who are you dominating, right? Like, what are you dominating? I'm not going to ask you if you're surprised by him moving, but I guess what's your overall thought in all of this? Moving him over there, I mean, I have serious worries about this. Like maybe, that's the first place that I go. I don't care really, schematic is going to be schematic. It is going to be what it is. I mean, they're going to have to be multiple because of this. But I just can't get over this defensive line and how bad it's gotten in such a short time.
Yeah, retention did not pan out.
Did not.
Thinking Mason Smith and Makai Wingo might come back, obviously don't happen. So, um, in terms of the moving chemo specifically, I think makes a lot of sense in terms of if you're going to pick one of those offensive linemen to move across the ball, he's probably the guy who was going to do it. 6'4", 310. He played some defensive line in high school. He's only played in 9 games over 3 seasons. And so while he might be someone who's on the 2 deep because of his experience and time in the program, if you're looking for a person to move over, that was somebody who I kind of circled on paper as like that might be the person who they choose. And so him going over there, I think that kind of makes a lot of sense. But what it means implies about the defensive front is not great, obviously. And
Right.
it's kind of, he'll give them 5 scholarship defensive tackles during spring practice. Ahmad Bro will even take some snaps inside, not as the nose guard, but like if they're in a 4-man front as kind of, the 3 tech, 5 tech kind of thing. I could see a situation. I'll be interested to see also throughout the spring if anybody else were to do that, like Savion or Parrish Shand or something like that. But obviously, as we've all talked about all offseason, they got to go get defensive tackles. They got to be able to get at least 1, probably 2. I would say at least 2, but maybe even 3 in the spring portal window. Ideally a difference maker, but at least some people who can come in and provide really quality.
Okay, we're back. All right, Wilson Alexander from The Advocate joining us. Wilson, last thing about football here. What do you expect coming out of spring from Garrett Nussmeier?
I don't think we're going to necessarily learn so much that anyone's opinion changes one way or another on Garrett because it's spring. Things are going to be vanilla. Even in the spring game, we won't really see a ton. I mean, gosh, Jaden went 10 of 11 in the spring game last year, and you still didn't really change your opinion much on Jaden because it was a spring game. But I think in terms of what LSU wants to see out of Garrett is just consistency. Right. We've seen it throughout his career that he's got all the arm talent in the world. He can make every single throw. It's just a matter of reining in some of those tendencies of maybe every once in a while having a decision that leaves you scratching your head and wondering why he did that. I feel like we saw a little bit less of that, especially in the bowl game against Wisconsin. But whereas it was kind of early in 2022 when he would get playing time against Southern, he made some decisions where you're just like, what was that? I feel like a lot of that's gone away, but it's still something that LSU's trying to iron out. Just wants to kind of get him to that next level because, as Brian Kelly said to me yesterday, if he can be consistent, he can be really, really good. And I think we all know that about Garrett. And so now it's just a matter of getting him to that point. And one of the things from a technical aspect that LSU is going to try to do to get him there is working through his progressions with a little bit more patiently. Was kind of the word Brian Kelly used. Sometimes Kelly said Garrett has a tendency to abort a little bit early. And so they're going to try to get him to hang in the pocket just a little bit longer.
Wilson, last thing for you before we get you out of here. New renovations or possibly non-renovations, but a new arena coming to Baton Rouge. I hadn't really talked about it because I think, it's going to be on March the 13th and a lot of things can happen. But what do you think is going to happen with this new potential arena and potentially basketball getting a whole new spot?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we'll have to kind of see how this plays out because this is extremely early still in the sort of process for this. But LSU would like to have a new arena built and kind of, sees it as part of a mixed use development, with restaurants, hotels, sort of be something that can be more of a hub of activity than just the, sort of sports itself. And they think it can attract more to Baton Rouge, in terms of concerts and events that have just kind of seemingly dried up a little bit over the last few years in particular. I mean, since I've been here, there just hasn't been a whole lot of that kind of thing going on. And so what has to happen, though, in order for that to get to that next place where LSU can start, getting bids from developers and then, come to a place where it picks a site and has renderings and actually maybe get this more off the ground, is at the River Center. They don't want to be competing against the River Center. So there has to be some kind of an agreement struck basically with the city and with the River Center and all those sorts of things so that it's not going to be like a competing venue. And so the River Center could change to be more of like a convention center. And this arena that would potentially be built would host more of the big events, anything over like certain numbers, which I certainly can't remember off the top of my head. But we'll see how it goes. It seems like it has support. Statements that we got yesterday from a lot of Baton Rouge city leaders were pretty gung-ho about it. Obviously, LSU's all about it. And so we'll kind of just have to continue to track it and see if it can actually come to fruition because we're still a ways off from this actually becoming a reality.
Never underestimate Scott Woodward working behind the scenes, huh? I mean, then you got the new warm up for baseball. They're going to be moving the mounds out of left and right foul line. So always interesting. Scott Woodward never sleeping. Who would figure? All right, that's Wilson Alexander from the Advocate. Thank you, buddy, so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Blake. Y'all have a great rest of your night.
All right, you too.